Give a warm NBF welcome to the person who coined the collaborative consumption phrase, Rachel Botsman.
I stay out too late, got nothing in my brain. That's what people say. That's what people say. I go on too many dates, but I can't make them stay.
Wow, there is a lot of you. It's lovely to be here this morning. I'm going to talk about the collaborative economy and give you a really honest picture as to what is working and where we're hitting some problems. And hopefully you'll walk away with a new way to think about value, scale, and trust. But just to give me a little bit of a feel for you, I'd like to start with a very simple exercise. Could you raise your hand if you have ever been a guest on Airbnb? Wow, that's probably around 2/3 of the room. Now, who is a host or has ever been a host on Airbnb? Less, because it requires more trust to be a host than a guest. And who owns Bitcoin? Okay, quite a few of you. And who used the wonderful rescue club based here in Finland? Nice. And then you don't have to tell me what you've bought, because I know you've just been on there for research purposes, but has anyone been on the dark web? A few brave people are raising their hand. Well, today I'm going to explain how all these ideas in some way are part of this new era of trust, where technology is transforming who we trust and where we place our trust. I thought I'd begin with a story of a company that really is like the godfather of technology transforming the way we can trust total strangers. So I'm sure many of you have heard the legend behind eBay, how eBay was first started. Now, do you have Pez dispensers in Finland? The things that pop sweets? Okay, so the story goes that Pierre Emilia started eBay to help his girlfriend buy and sell Pez dispensers. This is, in fact, a complete myth that was made up by the marketing department of eBay because they decided that the real story was too geeky. What happened was Pierre decided as an experiment to put a broken laser pointer that he had up for auction on his own website, wondering if anyone in the world would bid on a broken laser pointer. And even he was surprised that within 24 hours, he received a bid for $13.83. So we wrote to the guy and he said, "You do realize that this laser pointer is broken?" And the gentleman wrote back and said, "I am a collector of broken laser pointers." This is a dead true story. Now, what he realized in that moment was actually something very profound. He was a visionary in seeing how technology would do two things. The first thing he saw was how technology would create the efficiency to match supply and demand, that you have a need and someone else has a have, and that we can now connect through the internet. But what Pierre also saw was how technology would transform the way we could trust strangers. And it's these two ingredients that you see are the foundation of what we call the collaborative or sharing economy. And basically, it has many different names, but there is a definition. So the way I think of the collaborative economy is that it is an economic system that is using technology to unlock the value of assets through networks and marketplaces in ways that hopefully create greater efficiency, empowerment, and access. Now, the interesting thing about the collaborative economy is that you don't have to be running a startup. You don't have to be an entrepreneur to actually think in this way, because it's a really transformative way of thinking differently about value, scale, and trust. So one of the things that I found through meeting lots of entrepreneurs in this space is that they ask a very similar question when they start their businesses. And the question that they ask is, how can we extract new value from an existing asset? How can we extract new value from an existing asset? Let me give you an example of this. Has anyone used BlaBlaCar? Okay, that's very easy to count because it's 0. Okay, so BlaBlaCar was started by these 3 entrepreneurs in France. And they did something very common that entrepreneurs do. They found pain. They didn't go after an idea. They found pain that many people were experiencing. And the pain that they found was traffic congestion. So what they discovered through their research is that the average car in Europe has 1.7 people in it, to be precise. And what they observed was that all those empty seats in cars had value. Now, what those empty seats in cars represent is something very important that I call idling capacity. And idling capacity refers to the untapped social, economic, and environmental value of underused or underutilized assets. And what's happening is technology is allowing us to take this value and make it liquid in all kinds of interesting ways. So those empty seats in cars, they had idling capacity. Excess food has idling capacity. Unused capital has idling capacity. Spaces, people's homes have idling capacity. Unused Wi-Fi plans, idling capacity. The beautiful thing about idling capacity is it is absolutely everywhere. So they said, why don't we create a platform where we unlock the value of those seats? And we match drivers and passengers who are going on the same journeys around the same time. Now, there's one problem with this idea. I remember, as a child, being told never to get in a car with a stranger. And yet here you have a company that's now raised over $100 million and is worth more than $1 billion, that's saying, I can take this idea of getting in a car with a total stranger and make it feel safe for people. And what you have to keep in mind is that BlaBlaCar is not Uber. These are long-distance journeys. The average ride taken on BlaBlaCar is more than 350 kilometers. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm going to get in a car with a total stranger for more than 350 kilometers, I want to have a pretty good sense of who they are. And this is where technology becomes really interesting. So I'm sure many of you have profiles on LinkedIn and things like Facebook, but what these platforms are starting to figure out is what is the information you need in that particular context to trust the other person. Because this is really important. Trust is contextual. So what they're looking at here is what kind of music do you want to listen to? Are you a smoker? Are you going to bring your dog or your child along for the ride? But the really interesting thing to me that the research shows, the most important identifier as to whether you want to share a ride with that person is how much you talk in the car. So if this is where they get their name, right? So if you don't really want to talk, you just say you're blah. If you want a little bit of chit-chat, you're blah, 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 blah. And if you're not going to stop talking the entire way from London to Paris, you're blah, 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 blah. Now, I know this idea seems slightly ridiculous, but the remarkable thing to me is how they've hit scale. So to put this in context, they transport more people every single month from London to Paris than the Eurostar. So here you have this idea that is based on getting in a car with a stranger, unlocking the value of underutilized assets that suddenly in many countries around the world has become a mainstream behavior. What BlaBlaCar has done is created what I call a trust leap. And a trust leap is when we take a risk to do something new or to do it differently from the way that we've done something before. So a trust leap could be something like minor, like going online for your bill versus a paper bill. It could be sharing a ride with a stranger. It could be the first time that we get in a self-driving car. And what we're being asked today, and what technology is enabling us to do, is to leap faster and higher than ever before. The second thing that is really interesting about the collaborative economy is how entrepreneurs think very differently around scale to traditional businesses. And to bring this to life, I thought we would do a quick exercise. You're going to have to trust me that this isn't weird and I'm not going to embarrass you in any way. But what I need you to do is to take out your phones. Everyone take out your phones. And I need you to unlock the phone. And then I want you to give the phone to the person on your left or the person on the right. The idea is that you're not meant to have your own phone. And for 30 seconds, I am giving you permission to do whatever you want with that person's phone. You've only got 30 seconds. All right, you've had 10 seconds. Five more seconds. All right, you need to stop now. Okay, shh. You really need to stop now. And now you have to give the phone back. I know it'd be much more fun to play on someone else's phone for the rest of the session, but you got to give the phone back. Now, what's really interesting to me is that we like to believe we're complicated as human beings, but we're actually very predictable. And I can see from up here that you all fall into 3 distinct groups. So the first group, and I don't judge you, but you really don't want to do this exercise. So you kind of like either just hold on to your phone or you give that phone, but you're very clear not to touch it. The second group, you hand over the phone and you're the ones laughing. And it's the majority of us. And the reason why we're laughing is we're slightly uncomfortable. And you're sitting there and you're looking at the other person and you're tip-tapping away and you're swiping, but you're not really doing anything with that person's phone. And then there's a third group of you, and I'm not going to point anyone out, but I can see you from up here. You go straight into that phone, right? Some of you were taking photos and selfies, and I don't know who you were messaging on their Instagram or their Twitter, but within that 30 seconds, you went straight into that person's phone. Now, the reason why I'm making you do this exercise is that's your phone, it's 30 seconds, and you can see what that other person is doing, which is what makes some of these ideas around the collaborative economy amazing that they work. So I'm going to share a personal story with you that represents one of the biggest financial mistakes of my life, or I should say, my husband's mistake, not mine. So these are the 3 founders of Airbnb, Brian, Joe, and Nate, and this is when I first met them in 2008, when I was writing my first book. And the interesting thing was I met them, and after a while, when you meet lots of entrepreneurs, you kind of develop this nose. You have this sense that they're not just curious people, they're incredibly resilient. And they will take that idea and they will make it successful regardless of what it takes. So I met Brian, Joe, and Nate, and I was convinced that not just the idea, but them, they were really onto something. So I came back home and I said to my husband, Chris, who's a barrister, I should say. So any of you who are married to a lawyer, you might appreciate the story even more. I said to him, I think I've just met the next eBay, and we should invest in these guys because they have no money. And so he said, well, what do they do? And I said, well, they're going to encourage people all over the world to take photographs of their bedrooms and their bathrooms and all those rooms that they usually don't show to other people, and then they're going to post them on a website, and then strangers from all around the world are going to book those rooms. And he looked at me, and I'll never forget this. He said, this idea is never going to work. And the reason why it's not going to work is strangers will not trust one another. And I said to him, you know, I understand where you're coming from, but you're wrong. Look at eBay. People buy cars on eBay without even seeing them, and they're under pseudonyms like Invisible Wizard. And he made a really good point, because barristers are very good at arguing. He said, but eBay's different. eBay is online transactions. You're talking about offline experiences. Now, he was right, because it was very hard, even in 2008, to see how digital tools would enable us to have offline experiences, how we would actually use the internet to get off the internet to interact face-to-face. So he was a little bit right, but he was very, very wrong. Because many of you, I should say, that have been on Airbnb will know that part of the magic of the marketplace is that you can rent spare rooms and you can rent holiday homes, but you can rent all kinds of unique properties. So this is one here in Finland. Tree houses are a really popular category on Airbnb. You can stay in an aquarium, you can stay in an igloo. Now, the reason why I show you this slide is because what the Airbnb guys founders realized is that they could create a market for things that never had a marketplace before. Is that they could take all these fragmented assets and use technology to organize them in a new way. The other thing that they realized is that through this new model, they could really start to transform the way that people travel. And so if you think about the challenge for the traditional hospitality industry, is their model is incredibly asset heavy. Whereas Airbnb, it's completely scalable because it's asset light. They're creating a marketplace from these assets that already exist. So this chart is pretty remarkable when you think about it. When you think about that exercise that we did, that they are now the second most valuable hospitality brand in the world. And I should share with you that I keep this chart on our fridge with a little post-it note and a big arrow that says, always listen to your wife. Do you know, my husband actually called me this morning because he's with my 2 young kids, and he said, "You're not going to tell that Airbnb story." I said, "Oh, it's only like 20 or 30 people, so he doesn't need to know." Anyway, now, you may have seen this post. This post went quite viral, and it's really interesting because it was a great piece. It was written by a guy called Tom Goodwin from Havas Media. And he wrote that, Uber, the world's largest taxi company, owns no vehicles. And Facebook, the world's most popular media company, creates no content. And Alibaba, the most valuable retailer, has no inventory. And Airbnb, the second most valuable hospitality company, has no real estate. Something interesting is happening here. Now, what he was referring to was these first 2 principles that we talked about, value and scale. But I think he was missing something. And the general dialogue around the collaborative economy is missing something. And it's this third piece of trust. And this is what is remarkable about these ideas, but also what tends to lead to bad things happening. So what the Airbnb guys saw is that not just that they could create this marketplace for assets that never had a market before, they saw how technology could create a new kind of currency. And I think this lesson applies to most businesses. Most businesses that we interact with are built around money. And money only goes so far. Money is the currency of transactions. But where we live in the world today, we can use technology to create a new kind of currency. And trust is the currency of interactions. So the interesting thing to me, and this is what I've just written a new book on called Who Can You Trust, is how is technology transforming the way we trust? And is it making us smarter about who we trust? Or is it encouraging us to give our trust away too easily? So this is what I think is happening in the world, is that the amount of trust that we need is increasing. So if you think of the first wave of the web, things like eBay and Amazon, they were transactional. If you think about how we're using technology today, we're using them to have these push-button, rich experiences. It's like trust on speed. I was with a friend the other day, and she was like, I need my Uber in 2 minutes, I need my TaskRabbit in an hour, and I want to have a date by lunchtime. Like, it's this accelerated mode of trust. And the reason why this is so interesting is as technology enables trust in new forms, we're seeing this decline of trust in institutions. So survey after survey is telling us the same story, that trust in major institutions, banks, NGOs, charities, the media in particular, and government is at an all-time low. I personally don't like these surveys because they encourage the headline that trust is in a state of crisis. And I don't think that is what is happening to trust today. I think the fact is that institutional trust just wasn't designed for the digital age. And so what we see is all these companies with these institutional mechanisms, whether it's insurance brokers or real estate agents, or even the way they think about risk, butting up with these new digital technologies. So a more helpful way to think of trust is to think of it like energy, that it isn't being destroyed in the world, and instead it's changing form. So trust that used to flow upwards to referees and regulators and authorities is now flowing sideways through these networks, through social media, and through new technologies like the blockchain. And we've already seen this play out, right? We've seen how we no longer can rely on traditional top-down marketing, but that people are no longer passive consumers, but these social influencers that define brands. So at a macro level, the thing that underpins this collaborative economy is actually a paradigm shift around trust. And why we're feeling so much disruption and change is because trust is entering its third distinct chapter. And this is remarkable when you think about it, because society has only evolved trust in two distinct ways in the past. The first was local. So this is really easy to understand. It's when we lived in villages and communities, and everyone knew everyone else, and it was largely reputation-based. The second is institutional. Now, we invented institutional trust for a very good reason. People started to move to cities. We wanted to expand trade, so we invented things like corporate brands. We invented layers of intermediaries. It's that form of trust that is blowing up. And we're seeing this new form that I call distributed trust starting to take hold in different areas of our lives. So the way this works is pretty consistent. So if you look at distributed trust through these marketplaces and networks, it operates on these three levels. So if you think of BlaBlaCar, with BlaBlaCar, you have to trust that the idea of ride-sharing is safe and it's worth trying. That's trusting the idea. The second level is all about trusting the platform. Do you trust that BlaBlaCar will reduce the risk of bad things happening? Do you trust that BlaBlaCar will be there when things go wrong? And the last level is attached to those profiles. How do you decide whether the other person is trustworthy? What I want to focus on is the middle layer of the stack, because I think this is becoming one of the issues of our times. If you think about the current pressure that Facebook is on to moderate fake news, and it raises a really interesting question, was where does trust really reside in the digital age? So I've just picked Uber because they are in the news at the moment, but you think about it with Uber. Does trust lie in the company? Does it lie in the employees and the team? Does it lie more in the algorithms? Does it lie between the drivers and passengers? Is trust not important at all? Are we, as consumers, willing to let convenience trump trust? So this becomes a really pressing question, because we ask these questions when things go wrong. So I'm going to give you an extreme example of this. This gentleman here, his outfit's a little bit of a giveaway, but he's now in prison. But it was a tragic story. It happened February last year, and it happened in a place called Kalamazoo in Michigan. And basically what happened, this guy, Jason Dorton, he logged onto his Uber app around 4:30 p.m., and over the course of his shift, he shot and killed 6 people. Now, the thing that is remarkable about this story is that in between shooting people point blank, he continued to pick up passengers. This was a small town, Kalamazoo. People were on social media saying, "Don't get in the car with Jason Brian Dorton." It was all over the news and the radio. There's 2 fascinating parts to this story. The first was how Uber responded. So some of the passengers actually called the police. They unfortunately didn't do anything. They also called Uber. Now, you will know, using GPS, they could have known exactly where Jason was. This is what Uber said the day after it happened. Well, there were no red flags. I mean, he was a 4.73 out of 5. It's not really what you want to say. I mean, I don't know who did his media training, but I say this in all seriousness because we're relying on these tools and systems that just aren't good enough for the digital age. But the really interesting thing about this story, it's not to bash Uber, it's to actually think about ourselves as consumers. Because when I went back and read the police reports, the people who got in the car actually said, "Aren't you Jason Dalton, the serial killer?" And only one person rejected the ride. And when people were asked why, they said, "We never thought Uber would send us a serial killer." Now, to me, this is remarkable because it illustrates something very profound that is happening right now. And that is how we are starting to outsource our trust to an algorithm. And how, in many areas of our lives, we are giving our trust away very easily with a swipe, a click, an accept, and a share. And this is very dangerous when it comes to trust because efficiency is actually the enemy of trust. Trust needs friction. It needs us to slow down. It needs us to think about our decisions. So that's why I think the decision last week by the TfL was really interesting. And the interesting thing, so for those of you who don't know, the TfL refused to reissue Facebook's license in London. Now, they're not coming out and saying, "We think ride-sharing is bad." What they're coming out and saying is that you, the company, need to behave in a way that is responsible to hold this license. And so I think we're entering this new age of digital accountability. And what's really interesting to me is that, the collaborative economy is sort of like my third child. I've watched it grown up from being this infant and now to being this teenager that's kind of trying to figure out the rules. Now, in the first wave, it was good enough for entrepreneurs and businesses to figure out these first two things, value and scale. So I've got this idea, and I figured out these assets, and I'm going to use technology to connect these two things. Those days are over. The TfL decision and what's going on with Facebook represents how the sun has set on platforms being able to say, we are just neutral pathways that connect two people. We are just platforms that connect supply and demand. So I think what is really interesting and where we're going to see a wave of innovation is that we're now asking platforms to do two things. The first is to be proactive, to actually invent the tools that reduce the risk of bad things happening. And the second is within reason to be there when things go wrong. And so to go back to where we started at the beginning, it's like we're now in this third wave of technology and trust. The first wave was about information sharing and communication, which was fairly low risk. The second was transactional. I'm going to buy my broken laser pointer on eBay. But the third that we've entered into incredibly fast is experiential, about using these digital tools to have these very rich face-to-face interactions. So the challenge and the opportunity today is to really figure out how to use technology not to accelerate trust, but to allow us to make better decisions, to not give our trust away too easily. And so I think that the real disruption happening isn't about the blockchain, and it isn't about artificial intelligence or machine learning or automation. New technologies are just going to keep emerging. But when you dig underneath these things, the real transformation happening is how we think about trust. And the challenge for any leader in any organization is that the rules of how trust is built, managed, lost, and repaired are being turned upside down. That trust no longer resides with individuals, it lies between us. Thank you very much.
'Cause the players wanna play, 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 play.
if you don't
Sure.
mind. Let's just take the Uber example that you gave, where TfL have rejected the renewal of the license. However, 800,000, 900,000 Londoners have signed a petition to keep Uber. So, where does this sort of trust deficit confrontation get settled? Is it in a messy middle where eventually politicians capitulate, but Uber sort of makes minor improvements? Who wins in these battles?
So I think the TfL decision is a classic example of institutional and distributed trust coming together. And the petition is really interesting because I don't think people are voting for Uber, the company. They're voting for their cheap ride that they want to get home. They're voting for the service. And I have nothing against Uber, but I think what's going to happen is that if the ban stays in place, a competitor will enter the market. So this has happened in the US, that Lyft has entered the market. And without saying Uber's bad, but just being a more ethical company, they've taken 22% of the market share over the last 18 months. So I find this profound that, these businesses like Amazon, we're seeing it, that, with the taxes, that we're under this disguise that convenience trumps trust, but it's not a long-term strategy. Ryanair, the debacle with that, do we really want cheap flights? Or are we willing to pay a little bit more because it's actually a trusted brand?
But Michael O'Leary's view on the Ryanair example is, and he said it, even over the pilots and the cancellations, they'll come back. And as the Financial Times pointed out in the editorial last week, he's been proven right. People do come back. Passengers say, but what's it, O'Leary's line? My planes are full of passengers who said they'd never fly me again.
And he's right, for most people, because most people are driven by self-interest, and most people have a very short-term memory when it comes to trust. But I think we have to ask ourselves, is that the society we want to live in, or do we want to hold these companies to a higher degree of accountability? Because someone else will come along and provide the same service at the same price point, but behave better if we actually can hold these companies to account.
Right, but that is a slow process of economic evolution, isn't it? What you're talking about is rise of company, failure of company, and replacement of company. That can be months, if not years.
And in the middle, you get mess and chaos.
Yes.
And part of the problem is, it's very easy to point the finger at these entrepreneurs, and I hear it all the time, like that they don't have good intentions and they don't really want to make the world a better place. I don't think that's true. I think what happens is that these are issues of scale. So Airbnb is a really good example of this. When I first met them in 2008, whether it was naive or they just never dreamed their company would become so big, they couldn't see the unintended consequences. And so they couldn't see the impact that, you can say, oh, that's not true, but they couldn't see the impact that they would have on rents and things like that. So these issues are often issues of scale.
Question from Mattila in the audience. Do you think this evolution of trust away from institutions impacting things like fake news still can be turned around? How, and is it necessary? So can this change be turned around?
So, no, I don't think...
Should it be turned around?
So I don't think this evolution it's where technology naturally pulls things. So technology naturally takes things that were centralized and disperses them through a network. I think, though, this is an opportunity for institutions to figure out their role in all of this. Now, the answer isn't more regulation and compliance. The answer is actually to say, as an institution, we're more trustworthy. And, on the note of fake news, we're seeing this play out with the New York Times. The New York Times have never had such a good year. If you look at subscriptions...
Well, I can say the same about, forgive me interrupting, CNN. I mean, who I work for.
No, but it's different. It's different.
Our viewing figures have never been higher than they are at the moment.
But there's the reason why people are paying now and buying the New York Times is actually because they're saying, we want a trustworthy newspaper. We like that you're hiring qualified journalists. We like that you have a fact-checking department. I don't, with all due respect, think they're saying the same thing about CNN.
I'm not so sure I'd agree with you.
I don't think they are.
I'm not so sure I would agree with you on that.
I think trust wins in the long. I think this is the opportunity for institutions to actually stand up and say, these distributed models are going to exist. Take the banks, for example. Like, what is their role on the blockchain? What is their role with cryptocurrencies? So it's not like it's either or. It's that there are a role for institutions in this. And I also don't think you want regulation too early on, because if all this regulation had existed, the collaborative economy would never have happened.
But if you take your point on trust and institutional trust, whether it be media or government, the reality is we still need to have an element of trust in government, in regulation. So if there is this shift from institutional to distributive trust, what is the effect on, say, for example, our relationship to our governments?
It's so fun. I mean, when people say, oh, trust in governments is an all-time low, trust has always been low in governments. That's not the interesting... I mean, the interesting institution to look at, not to point the finger back at you, is the media. I mean, the media has
took you 20 minutes to get
experienced the sharpest decline. But no, the point being...
Why is that? I'll give you...
Is that for me or for them?
Why is that?
Why has...
Yeah. I mean, we spend more money sending more people to more difficult parts of the world to cover more stories in more detail. And we do it with the most qualified people anywhere in the world. And that's not just myself, that's the BBC, it's Sky News, it's Al Jazeera, there's a whole range of us. We're all doing it. So why is that?
So I think it's tied to two things. One is we don't know the difference between the truth and fiction. We don't know what is an opinion and what is fact. So we're tuning into people who are very good at talking to our feelings versus what is factually true, which I think is a huge problem. So in this information overload, it's like, who do I listen to? Who is trustworthy? So it's the sheer volume of information and then also the distribution channels so that you're seeing real news against fake news. And then the second thing is I actually think, and I'm part of the media industry, so I hold myself to account, is are we doing a good enough job? We are a public service, and are we holding institutions and leaders to account? So when things like the financial crisis happen, when things like the Panama Papers, are we telling these stories? Are we telling these stories and holding institutions and leaders to account?
I have gone way over time.
I know you got quite into that last question about the media.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'd have to agree. Provocative, absolutely fascinating. Rachel Botsman.
Thank you very much.
'Cause the players wanna play, 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 play.